The elderly woman's voice cut through the opulent silence like a blade through silk. "That man is not your father." The words hung in the air of the marble-floored foyer, and Marcus Whitmore felt his world tilt on its axis. Standing frozen in his tailored Armani suit, champagne flute suspended halfway to his lips, the tech mogul's carefully constructed facade cracked for just a moment, long enough for someone paying attention to see the flash of pure terror in his eyes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The woman who had spoken those earth-shattering words was Consuela Valdez, a 73-year-old housekeeper who had worked for the Whitmore family for over 4 decades. She stood in the shadows of the grand staircase, her weathered hands gripping a silver serving tray, her dark eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made him feel exposed. Despite being surrounded by 300 of Silicon Valley's most powerful elite, this was the night of the Whitmore Foundation's annual charity gala, held at the sprawling Malibu estate that Marcus had called home for 38 years. The event was a carefully orchestrated display of philanthropy and power, where tech titans rubbed shoulders with Hollywood royalty and political heavyweights, all while opening their wallets for Marcus's latest cause, funding education in underprivileged communities. The irony of that mission statement would become crystal clear before the evening's end. Dr. Sarah Chen, Marcus's personal physician and longtime family friend, had been standing beside him when Consuela's words shattered the evening's carefully maintained veneer. Sarah had known Marcus since his supposed childhood, had treated him through various ailments and injuries over the decades, and had never questioned his identity. Why would she? He was Marcus Whitmore, heir to the Whitmore technology fortune, a man whose face graced the covers of Forbes and Time, whose innovations in artificial intelligence had revolutionized 3 different industries. But now, watching Marcus's reaction to the old woman's accusation, Sarah felt a cold knot of doubt forming in her stomach. She had seen that look before, not on Marcus, but in her medical practice, on the faces of patients who had been caught in lies that could no longer be sustained. It was the expression of someone whose deepest secrets were about to be dragged into the light. The gala continued around them, guests mingling and chatting, completely unaware of the drama unfolding near the main entrance. A string quartet played softly in the corner, while servers circulated with hors d'oeuvre and vintage wine. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the assembled crowd, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance that Marcus had spent years perfecting. Everything about the evening was designed to reinforce his image as old money sophistication, despite the fact that his fortune was relatively new by California standards. Marcus had built his empire on quantum computing algorithms that had made traditional encryption methods obsolete overnight. His company, Whitmore Dynamics, held patents worth billions and had government contracts that were classified at the highest levels. He was exactly the kind of success story that Silicon Valley loved to celebrate, a brilliant mind who had transformed abstract mathematical concepts into world-changing technology. But Consuela had known him before any of that success, had worked in the household when he was supposedly just a shy, awkward teenager, struggling with advanced mathematics and computer programming. She had prepared his meals, washed his clothes, and watched him grow from an introverted child into the confident businessman he had become. If anyone would know the truth about his identity, it would be her. The old woman set down her serving tray on a nearby antique table and approached Marcus with deliberate steps. Her formal uniform was impeccable as always, but there was something different about her demeanor tonight. The usual deference was gone, replaced by a quiet determination that made Sarah instinctively step closer to Marcus, though she couldn't have explained why. "Señor Marcus," Consuela said, her accented English carrying clearly despite the background noise of the party. "We need to talk. There are things you don't know, things I should have told you years ago." Marcus glanced around nervously, clearly aware that several nearby guests had turned their attention toward the conversation. Among them was Jonathan Reeves, the investigative journalist from the Los Angeles Tribune, who had been trying to dig into Marcus's background for months, searching for any inconsistencies in the carefully crafted biography that Whitmore Dynamics' public relations team had distributed to the media. "Consuela," Marcus said, his voice carefully modulated to sound calm and in control. "This isn't the time or place for whatever this is about. We can discuss any concerns you have tomorrow, in private." But the elderly woman shook her head firmly. Tomorrow will be too late. Tonight, the truth comes out. Tonight, you learn about the boy who should have been standing where you are. Sarah felt her medical training kick in as she observed the physical changes in Marcus. His breathing had become shallow, his pupils slightly dilated, and a thin sheen of perspiration had appeared on his forehead despite the cool temperature maintained throughout the mansion. These were classic signs of acute stress response, the body's reaction to perceived threats. But what threat could an elderly housekeeper possibly pose to one of the most powerful men in America? The answer came in the form of a photograph that Consuela withdrew from the pocket of her uniform. It was old and slightly faded, showing two young boys who appeared to be around 10 years old. They were standing side by side in what looked like the same foyer where this conversation was now taking place, though the decor was different, suggesting the photo had been taken decades earlier. "This is you," Consuela said, pointing to one of the boys in the photograph. But as Sarah looked closer, she realized something was wrong. The boy Consuela was indicating looked nothing like Marcus. The facial structure was completely different. The eyes were brown instead of Marcus's distinctive green, and the overall build was much smaller and more delicate. "And this," Consuela continued, pointing to the second boy, "is who you replaced." Marcus reached for the photograph with trembling fingers, studying it intently. Even from where she stood, Sarah could see that the second child bore an unmistakable resemblance to the man Marcus had become. The same strong jawline, the same piercing green eyes, the same confident posture even at such a young age. "I don't understand," Marcus whispered, though something in his voice suggested that perhaps he understood more than he was willing to admit. Consuela's expression softened slightly, the stern determination giving way to something that looked almost like maternal concern. "You were both here that summer, 32 years ago. Two brilliant boys, both fascinated by computers and mathematics, both hungry to prove themselves to Mr. Whitmore." She was referring to Harrison Whitmore, Marcus's supposed father, who had died in a car accident 15 years earlier. Harrison had been a formidable figure in the early days of personal computing, a visionary who had built his fortune by anticipating technological trends years before his competitors. He had also been known for his ruthless business practices and his complete intolerance for failure or weakness. "Mr. Harrison was looking for an heir," Consuela continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone recounting a long-held secret. "His own son was sick, very sick, with a condition the doctor said would kill him before his 18th birthday. But he had met this other boy, a genius from a poor family in San Diego, someone whose mind worked the same way his did." Sarah found herself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite her growing unease about where it was heading. Around them the party continued, but she noticed that Jonathan Reeves had moved closer, clearly eavesdropping on every word. This was exactly the kind of story that could destroy careers and bring down empires. "The switch happened gradually," Consuela said, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard by too many people. "First, the sick boy went away for treatment. Then the other boy came to stay permanently. New identity papers were created, medical records were altered, and everyone who might have noticed the differences was either paid to stay quiet or convinced that the changes were due to medical treatments and growth spurts." Marcus stared at the photograph, his hands shaking visibly now. "You're telling me that I'm not Harrison Whitmore's son? That I'm some kind of imposter who stole another child's life?" "Not stole," Consuela corrected gently. "You were just a boy, 12 years old, taken from poverty and given every advantage money could buy. You didn't choose this deception. It was chosen for you. But the real Marcus Whitmore, the sick boy, he didn't die as everyone believed." The words hit like a physical blow. Sarah watched as Marcus stumbled backward, nearly dropping his champagne glass. She reached out to steady him, her medical instincts overriding her shock at what she was hearing. "That's impossible," Marcus managed to say. "If what you're claiming were true, where is this other person? Why hasn't he come forward? Why wait 32 years to tell this story?" Consuela's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since the conversation began, her composure wavered. "Because I raised him myself, in secret, watching from a distance as you lived the life that should have been his. Because he is my grandson, the child of my daughter who worked as a secretary in Mr. Harrison's company before she died in that same car accident that killed him." The revelation sent shockwaves through the small group that had gathered around them. Sarah felt her knees go weak as the implications began to sink in. If Consuela was telling the truth, then Marcus Whitmore, the man she had known and trusted for decades, was living under a stolen identity, had built his entire empire on a foundation of lies. But there was more. Consuela reached into her other pocket and withdrew a manila envelope, thick with documents. "Medical records," she said, handing them to Sarah. "Birth certificates, school transcripts, even DNA analysis that I commissioned last year when I finally decided the truth had to come out." Sarah opened the envelope with trembling fingers, her medical expertise immediately recognizing the authenticity of the documents. The DNA analysis showed a clear match between Consuela's genetic profile and that of someone identified only as Subject A, but the photograph attached to the analysis showed the same face that had been staring back at her from magazine covers for years. "This can't be right," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it was. The medical records painted a picture of a brilliant but sickly child who had been given up for dead, only to recover gradually over many years under Consuela's care. The birth certificate showed a date of birth that matched Marcus's exactly, but listed parents she had never heard of. Marcus snatched the documents from her hands, scanning them desperately as if looking for some proof that this was all an elaborate hoax. But the evidence was overwhelming, documented with the kind of meticulous detail that could only come from someone who had been planning this revelation for years. "Where is he now?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible above the sounds of the party. "This person you claim is the real Marcus Whitmore?" Consuela smiled sadly and looked toward the main entrance of the mansion. "He's here tonight. He's been watching you for years, learning about the life that was stolen from him, preparing for this moment when the truth would finally be revealed." As if summoned by her words, a figure appeared in the doorway. He was tall and lean, with the same dark hair and green eyes as Marcus, but there was something different about his presence. Where Marcus projected confidence and authority, this man seemed to carry himself with a quiet dignity, the bearing of someone who had known hardship but had not been broken by it. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the face from the childhood photograph, aged and matured but unmistakably the same person. The real Marcus Whitmore, if that's who this truly was, walked slowly across the foyer, his eyes never leaving the man who had been living his life. "Hello, brother," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of years spent far from the privileged world of Malibu mansions and Silicon Valley boardrooms. "I think it's time we talked." The confrontation that followed would be seared into Sarah's memory forever. Marcus, or whoever he really was, stood face to face with his genetic double, two men who shared an uncanny physical resemblance but had lived completely different lives. The contrast was striking. One dressed in designer clothing and radiating wealth and power, the other wearing a simple but well-tailored suit that spoke of modest means but careful attention to appearance. "This is insane," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Even if what you're saying is true, I've been living this life for over 30 years. I've built a company, created jobs for thousands of people, contributed billions to charitable causes. Whatever happened when we were children, I've earned the right to be called Marcus Whitmore." The other man, Sarah found herself thinking of him as the true Marcus, nodded thoughtfully. "You're right about one thing. You have accomplished remarkable things with the opportunities you were given, but they were my opportunities, stolen from a sick child who was supposed to die quietly and be forgotten." "But you didn't die," Marcus shot back. "You're here, you're healthy, you've obviously been planning this for years. What do you want? Money? A share of the company? Some kind of public acknowledgement?" "True," Marcus shook his head slowly. "I don't want your money or your company. I want something much more precious than that. I want my son to know who his real father is." The words dropped like a bomb into the conversation. Sarah felt the world spin around her as she realized the full scope of what was being revealed. It wasn't just about stolen identity or misplaced inheritance. There was a child involved, an innocent victim of this decades-old deception. "I have a son," True Marcus continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "He's 16 years old, brilliant like both of us, but he's been raised believing that his father is nobody special, just a man who works in computers and has never amounted to much. He doesn't know that his real legacy includes one of the most successful technology companies in the world." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Marcus staggered backward, overwhelmed by the implications. You're married? You have a family? I was married, True Marcus corrected. My wife died 3 years ago from the same genetic condition that nearly killed me as a child. The doctors say our son has a 50% chance of developing it as well, but there are experimental treatments available now, treatments that cost millions of dollars and require connections to the best medical research facilities in the world. Sarah understood immediately. This wasn't just about identity theft or family secrets. It was about a father desperate to save his son's life, using the only leverage he had against the man who had unknowingly stolen his birthright. You want access to my medical contacts, Marcus said, his business acumen cutting through the emotional chaos. You want me to use my connections and resources to help your son. Our son, True Marcus corrected. Genetically, he's as much your responsibility as mine. We share the same DNA, the same medical history, the same family legacy. The only difference is that you've had 30 years to build the resources needed to save him, while I've spent those same 30 years struggling just to keep him fed and healthy. The moral complexity of the situation was staggering. Sarah looked back and forth between the two men, seeing the same intelligence, the same determination, the same fundamental decency despite their vastly different circumstances. Marcus had indeed accomplished incredible things with the life he'd been given, but those accomplishments had come at the cost of another person's birthright. Consuela had remained silent during this exchange, but now she stepped forward again. There's more you need to know, she said to Marcus. The car accident that killed Mr. Harrison and my daughter. It wasn't an accident. Someone wanted to eliminate the witnesses to what had been done, to make sure the truth could never come out. The accusation sent shockwaves through the small group. Sarah felt her medical training inadequate to process the implications of what she was hearing. Murder, conspiracy, decades of cover-up. It was the stuff of thriller novels, not real life among California's tech elite. Who? Marcus demanded. Who would have wanted them dead? Consuela's expression hardened. The same person who convinced Mr. Harrison to make the switch in the first place, who arranged for the false documents and the altered medical records, someone who stood to benefit from having a controllable heir to the Whitmore fortune, someone who could manipulate a grateful orphan more easily than a legitimate son who might ask uncomfortable questions. She reached into her envelope of documents and withdrew one final piece of evidence, a letter written in Harrison Whitmore's distinctive handwriting, dated just weeks before his death. Sarah watched as Marcus read it, his face growing pale as the contents became clear. He was planning to reverse the switch, Marcus whispered. He was going to tell the truth and restore the real Marcus to his rightful place as heir. And someone killed him to prevent that from happening, True Marcus said grimly. Someone who had spent years positioning themselves to control the Whitmore fortune through you, and who couldn't afford to have their carefully laid plans destroyed by an attack of conscience. Sarah found herself looking around the party with new eyes, wondering if the person responsible for this decades-old conspiracy was somewhere among the assembled guests, watching this confrontation unfold and calculating their next move. The thought sent a chill down her spine as she realized how vulnerable they all were in this moment of truth. The revelation was interrupted by the approach of another figure, Victoria Sterling, Marcus's business partner and the chief financial officer of Whitmore Dynamics. She had been Marcus's closest confidant for the past decade, the architect of many of the financial strategies that had built the company into a tech powerhouse. Her presence at this particular moment seemed more than coincidental. Marcus, Victoria said, her voice carefully controlled, I think we need to move this conversation somewhere more private. People are starting to notice, and Jonathan Reeves has been recording everything on his phone. Sarah looked around and realized that Victoria was right. A small crowd had gathered at the edges of their conversation, guests pretending to mingle while clearly listening to every word. The story of Marcus Whitmore's stolen identity was about to become very public, very quickly. But True Marcus stepped forward, blocking Victoria's path to Marcus. Actually, I think it's time this conversation became very public indeed. The truth has been hidden long enough. Victoria's composure slipped for just a moment, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something cold and calculating beneath her professional facade. I don't know who you are or what you think you're proving with this elaborate performance, but threatening Mr. Whitmore with false accusations is both illegal and foolish. The only thing that's false here is the identity he's been living under, True Marcus replied calmly. But I suspect you already know that, don't you, Victoria? After all, someone had to help maintain the deception all these years, someone with access to financial records and legal documents, Someone who could ensure that any inconvenient questions about Marcus's background were quietly buried. The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sarah watched as Victoria's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, anger, and then a cold calculation that sent ice through her veins. This was not the reaction of an innocent person hearing shocking news for the first time. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Marcus has been my business partner for over a decade. I know exactly who he is." "Yes," True Marcus agreed. "The question is whether you've always known who he really isn't." The confrontation was spiraling into dangerous territory, and Sarah found herself wondering if they were all in physical danger. If True Marcus was right about the car accident being murder, and if Victoria was somehow involved in the conspiracy, then there was no telling how far she might go to protect her secrets. But before anyone could respond, Consuela spoke up one final time. "There's something else you all need to see," she said, pulling out an old smartphone. "I've been recording conversations in this house for years, ever since I realized what had really happened to the children. Last week, I finally captured the evidence I needed." She pressed play on a recording, and Victoria's voice filled the air, crisp and clear despite the obvious attempt at privacy. The conversation was clearly between Victoria and an unidentified man, discussing the need to eliminate the loose ends and, quote, permanently silence anyone who might threaten the arrangement. The blood drained from Victoria's face as she realized what she was hearing. The recording was damning evidence of conspiracy, possibly including plans for murder. Around them, the party guests had fallen silent, everyone straining to hear the explosive revelations that were unfolding. "That recording is inadmissible," Victoria said desperately. "It was obtained illegally, without consent, and could have been fabricated or edited." "Perhaps," True Marcus acknowledged, "but it's enough to justify a full investigation into Harrison Whitmore's death, into the falsified documents that created Marcus's identity, and into the financial irregularities that have allowed Whitmore Dynamics to grow so rapidly while its competitors have faced mysterious setbacks." Sarah realized that she was witnessing the unraveling of one of Silicon Valley's greatest success stories. The implications went far beyond personal identity theft. If True Marcus's accusations were correct, then Whitmore Dynamics had been built on a foundation of murder, fraud, and corporate espionage spanning 3 decades. The evening that had begun as a celebration of philanthropy and achievement was ending with accusations of the most serious crimes imaginable. And at the center of it all was Marcus Whitmore, or whoever he really was, a man who might be both victim and beneficiary of a conspiracy that had shaped his entire life. As Sarah looked around at the assembled crowd of tech titans, politicians, and celebrities, she realized that everyone present was about to become part of one of the biggest scandals in California history. The story of the stolen identity would make headlines around the world, bringing down not just Marcus but potentially dozens of others who had been complicit in maintaining the deception. But the most tragic victim of all was standing right in front of them, a 16-year-old boy who would soon learn that his father was not who he appeared to be, and that his own life hung in the balance while powerful adults fought over money, identity, and the consequences of choices made decades before he was born. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Marcus felt every eye in the foyer boring into him, waiting for his response to the damning recording that had just shattered his world. The weight of 32 years of lies pressed down on his shoulders like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe in the suddenly stifling atmosphere of his own home. Victoria Sterling's face had transformed from confident authority to barely controlled panic. Her manicured fingers gripped her clutch purse so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, and Sarah noticed a slight tremor in her hands that spoke of someone fighting to maintain composure while their carefully constructed world collapsed around them. "You have to understand," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the hushed foyer. Harrison Whitmore was dying when he made the decision to switch the boys. He had terminal cancer, hidden from everyone except his closest advisors. He knew his biological son wouldn't live to inherit the company, and he couldn't bear the thought of everything he'd built falling into the hands of distant relatives who had never shown any interest in technology or innovation. The admission sent ripples through the assembled crowd. Jonathan Reeves had his phone out, recording everything, while other guests began pulling out their own devices. This was no longer a private family matter. It was becoming a very public confession to decades of fraud and conspiracy. True Marcus stepped closer to his genetic twin, and the resemblance between them was so striking that several guests gasped audibly. Side by side, there was no denying they were the same person, split by circumstance into two completely different lives. The man who had lived as Marcus Whitmore radiated wealth and privilege, while his counterpart carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned everything through struggle. "Tell them about the night you convinced Harrison to fake his own son's death," True Marcus said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the accusation. "Tell them how you arranged for the medical records to show that I had died from complications related to my genetic condition, while you spirited me away to live with Consuela in secret." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. Tears began streaming down her face, smearing her carefully applied makeup and revealing the exhausted woman beneath the polished executive facade. "He was going to die anyway," she sobbed. "The doctors gave him 6 months at most. And this boy," she gestured toward the man who had lived as Marcus, "he was a genius, maybe the only person alive who could understand Harrison's vision and carry it forward." Dr. Sarah Chen found herself thinking like a physician, trying to process the medical implications of what she was hearing. "You faked a death certificate for a 12-year-old child," she said, her voice heavy with professional outrage. "Do you have any idea how many laws that violated? How many people had to be complicit in such a massive deception?" "More than you might think," Consuela interjected, her elderly voice carrying the weight of decades of buried secrets. "The family doctor, the hospital administrators, even some government officials who owed favors to Mr. Harrison. Money can buy many things, including official records and sworn testimonies." The old woman reached into her seemingly endless supply of documents and withdrew a thick folder bound with a rubber band. Death certificate, cremation records, even a false obituary that ran in 3 major newspapers. All of it fabricated to cover up the theft of a child's identity. Marcus, or the man who had lived under that name, finally found his voice. Why keep the real Marcus alive at all? If the goal was to replace him with someone more suitable, why not just let nature take its course? True Marcus answered before anyone else could speak. Because Victoria had plans that went beyond what Harrison imagined. She didn't just want a controllable heir to the Whitmore fortune, she wanted insurance. A way to maintain control even if her chosen replacement ever developed inconvenient moral qualms or started asking too many questions. The implication was chilling. Sarah realized that True Marcus was suggesting Victoria had kept him alive as a form of blackmail material, a living secret that could be used to control the false Marcus if he ever stepped out of line. "For 32 years, she's been the power behind the throne," True Marcus continued, "making the real decisions while allowing you to be the public face of the company. Every major business move, every acquisition, every strategic partnership, all of it filtered through Victoria's agenda." The accusation resonated with uncomfortable truth. Sarah had often wondered why Marcus seemed to defer so completely to Victoria's financial judgment, why he never made major decisions without consulting her first. She had attributed it to smart business practice, but now she saw it in a different light, the behavior of someone who knew, on some level, that his entire life was built on a lie that could be exposed at any moment. Victoria straightened her shoulders, seeming to draw strength from having her secrets finally revealed. "I saved Whitmore Dynamics," she said defiantly. "Harrison's biological son would have died before his 18th birthday, and the company would have been torn apart by inheritance battles and hostile takeovers. Everything we built, all the innovations that changed the world, the thousands of jobs we created, none of that would have existed without the decisions I made. Built on murder," True Marcus said quietly. "Don't forget that part of your legacy, Victoria. Harrison Whitmore and Maria Valdez died because they were planning to expose the truth. 2 people who might have lived for decades more, killed to protect your elaborate deception." The mention of his mother's name seemed to age Consuela by years in an instant. Her granddaughter had been more than just a secretary at Whitmore Dynamics. She had been the one person who knew all the details of the identity switch, the only witness who could have unraveled the entire conspiracy. Her death in the same car accident that killed Harrison Whitmore had eliminated the last obstacle to Victoria's complete control over the situation. "The brake lines were cut," Consuela said, her voice breaking with grief and rage. I had the car examined by a private investigator after the funeral. Someone wanted to make sure that neither Mr. Harrison nor my daughter would ever be able to tell the truth about what had been done to the children. The revelation of premeditated murder sent shockwaves through the crowd. This was no longer just a story about identity theft and corporate fraud. It was about cold-blooded killing to cover up a conspiracy that had enriched some of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley. Jonathan Reeves stepped forward, his journalist instincts overriding his role as a party guest. Victoria Sterling, are you confessing to conspiracy to commit murder? Are you admitting that you arranged the deaths of Harrison Whitmore and Maria Valdez to cover up the identity theft you orchestrated? Victoria's lawyer instincts finally kicked in, and she clamped her mouth shut, refusing to say another word. But the damage was already done. She had admitted to enough felonies to ensure she would spend the rest of her life in prison, assuming she lived long enough to face trial. The false Marcus was staring at his hands, perhaps seeing them clearly for the first time in decades. Everything he had accomplished, every innovation he had created, every success he had celebrated, all of it built on the stolen life of another person. The weight of that realization seemed to physically diminish him, his confident posture sagging under the burden of 32 years of unknowing complicity. "What happens now?" he asked, directing the question to True Marcus. "Do you want me to publicly confess? Sign over control of the company? Disappear so you can reclaim your rightful life?" True Marcus shook his head slowly. "I don't want your life," he said with surprising gentleness. "I want my son to have the chance at the life he deserves. I want him to receive the medical treatment that might save him, and I want him to know the truth about his heritage. But I don't want to destroy you in the process. You're as much a victim of this conspiracy as I am." The generosity of spirit in those words seemed to break something inside the false Marcus. He began to cry, not the controlled tears of a man trying to maintain his dignity, but the broken sobs of someone whose entire sense of self had just been shattered. Dr. Sarah Chen stepped forward, her medical training overriding her shock at the evening's revelations. "We need to get both of you somewhere private where we can discuss this rationally," she said. "And we need to start making arrangements for your son's medical care immediately. Every day we delay could be crucial to his treatment." But True Marcus held up a hand, stopping her. "There's one more thing everyone needs to hear," he said. Victoria wasn't the only one involved in maintaining this deception. The conspiracy reaches much higher than anyone has imagined. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a smartphone, pressing play on a video that made several guests gasp in recognition. The footage showed a much younger Victoria Sterling in conversation with Senator James Morrison, currently one of the most powerful politicians in Washington, and a longtime supporter of technology industry interests. The video's audio was crystal clear, Morrison's voice discussing the need to maintain the arrangement and ensure that the Whitmore situation never becomes public. He was clearly aware of the identity theft and had been using his political influence to suppress any investigations that might have exposed the truth. "Senator Morrison has been taking money from Whitmore Dynamics for 15 years, True Marcus explained. Campaign contributions, speaking fees, consulting contracts, all of it designed to buy his silence and his protection. When federal investigators started looking into irregularities in the technology industry, he made sure they stayed away from anything connected to our case." The implications were staggering. A United States senator had been complicit in covering up murder and identity theft, using his office to protect a criminal conspiracy that had lasted for over 3 decades. The scandal would reach the highest levels of government and potentially bring down one of the most prominent political figures in the country. Sarah looked around the party and realized that many of the guests were themselves potentially implicated in the conspiracy. Tech industry leaders who had done business with Whitmore Dynamics, politicians who had received campaign contributions, journalists who had written puff pieces about Marcus's supposed genius. How many of them had known or suspected the truth and chosen to remain silent? The sound of sirens in the distance suggested that someone had finally called the police. Whether it was one of the party guests or someone who had been monitoring the situation from outside, law enforcement was clearly on its way to take control of what had become a crime scene. Victoria Sterling seemed to come to the same realization. She began looking around frantically, perhaps searching for an escape route or calculating her chances of fleeing before the authorities arrived. But Consuela stepped forward, blocking her path to the nearest exit. "You're not going anywhere," the elderly woman said with quiet determination. "You've run from the truth for 32 years, But tonight, it ends. Tonight, my daughter and Mr. Harrison finally get justice. The false Marcus wiped tears from his eyes and stood up straighter, seeming to reach some kind of internal decision. I want to make a full confession, he announced to the assembled crowd. I want to tell the authorities everything I know about how this conspiracy was maintained, everyone who was involved, every crime that was committed to keep the truth buried. True Marcus nodded approvingly. That's the first step toward redemption, he said. But more importantly, it's the first step toward getting my son the help he needs. Dr. Chen stepped forward again. I want to help with your son's medical care, she offered. I have connections to the best research hospitals in the world, and I can ensure he gets access to the most advanced treatments available. The offer seemed to lift a weight from True Marcus's shoulders. For the first time since entering the mansion, he smiled, a genuine expression of relief and gratitude that transformed his entire appearance. The police sirens were getting closer now, and several guests had begun making their way toward the exits, clearly eager to distance themselves from what was about to become a very public criminal investigation. But Jonathan Reeves remained, still recording everything, knowing that he was witnessing one of the biggest stories of his career. There's something else you should know, True Marcus said, addressing the false Marcus directly. Your real name, the identity you were born with, is David Santiago. Your parents were migrant farm workers who died in an accident when you were 10 years old. You have relatives in San Diego who have been wondering what happened to you for over 30 years. The revelation added another layer of tragedy to an already overwhelming situation. Not only had David Santiago been living under a stolen identity, but he had been completely cut off from his biological family, people who had been grieving his disappearance for decades. I have cousins, David asked, using his real name for the first time in over 3 decades. 3 cousins, 2 aunts, and an uncle who never stopped looking for you, True Marcus confirmed. They hired private investigators, put up missing person posters, even offered rewards for information about your whereabouts. They never gave up hope that you might still be alive somewhere. The emotional weight of that knowledge seemed almost too much for David to bear. He had spent his entire adult life believing he was alone in the world, an orphan who had been given unprecedented opportunities by a benevolent benefactor. Learning that he had family members who had been searching for him all these years was both a gift and a crushing reminder of all the relationships that had been stolen from him. The police cars were pulling into the circular driveway now, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows through the mansion's tall windows. Federal agents would undoubtedly follow. Crimes of this magnitude, involving this level of political corruption, would require resources and expertise that local law enforcement couldn't provide. Victoria Sterling made one final attempt to control the narrative. None of this proves anything, she said desperately. It's all circumstantial evidence and hearsay. Any competent lawyer could get these charges dismissed or reduced to minor infractions. But Consuela smiled grimly and held up her smartphone one more time. Not when they hear the recording I made of you ordering the deaths of Mr. Harrison and my daughter, she said. The conversation where you specifically instructed your hired killer about how to make the brake failure look like an accident. The blood drained from Victoria's face as she realized that Consuela had been recording her conversations for much longer than anyone had suspected. The elderly housekeeper had spent years gathering evidence, building an airtight case against the people who had destroyed her family and stolen a child's life. The first police officers entered the foyer just as Victoria collapsed into a nearby chair, finally accepting that her decades-long conspiracy had been completely exposed. The game was over, and there would be no escape from the consequences of her actions. Detective Ray Castellanos, a veteran investigator with the Los Angeles Police Department, took charge of the scene immediately. He quickly separated the key witnesses, ensuring that their stories couldn't be coordinated or influenced by continued contact with each other. David Santiago found himself sitting in what had been his home office for 20 years. Trying to explain to a federal agent how he had unknowingly lived his entire adult life under a stolen identity. The surreal nature of the conversation, confessing to being the victim of identity theft, while simultaneously admitting to being an unwitting accomplice to fraud, challenged both his ability to articulate the truth and the agent's ability to understand it. True Marcus was in the library, providing detailed testimony about his secret life with Consuela, the medical treatments that had saved him from the genetic condition that was supposed to kill him, and the years of careful investigation that had led to tonight's confrontation. His primary concern remained his son's medical needs, and he repeatedly asked the agents when he would be able to arrange for proper treatment. Dr. Sarah Chen found herself in the uncomfortable position of being both a witness to the evening's events and a potential co-conspirator in the medical fraud that had hidden True Marcus's survival. Her professional ethics demanded that she cooperate fully with the investigation, even though doing so might implicate colleagues in medical institutions that had been her partners for decades. The interrogations continued through the night, with federal agents, local detectives, and specialists from various agencies working to untangle 32 years of carefully maintained lies. The complexity of the case was unprecedented. It involved identity theft, medical fraud, political corruption, corporate espionage, and multiple murders spanning more than 3 decades. By dawn, the basic outlines of the conspiracy had been established. Victoria Sterling had indeed orchestrated the entire scheme, beginning with her manipulation of a dying Harrison Whitmore and culminating in the murders that had eliminated the witnesses to her crimes. Senator Morrison and at least 6 other political figures were implicated in the cover-up, while dozens of business leaders and medical professionals had been either complicit or willfully ignorant of the obvious inconsistencies in Marcus Whitmore's background. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. By the time the sun rose over Malibu, news vans were lined up outside the mansion's gates, and reporters from around the world were scrambling to understand and explain a story that challenged comprehension. The phrase "stolen identity billionaire" began trending on social media within hours, as people struggled to process the implications of such a massive and long-lasting deception. David Santiago's real family was contacted by authorities within hours of his true identity being established. The reunion was arranged for later that week, giving him time to process the emotional upheaval of learning that people who loved him had been searching for him for over 30 years. The knowledge that he had relatives who had never given up hope provided some comfort in the midst of losing everything he had thought he knew about himself. True Marcus's son was admitted to the best pediatric research hospital in Los Angeles that same morning, beginning a comprehensive evaluation that would determine the exact nature of his genetic condition and the treatment options available to him. For the first time in his young life, money would not be an obstacle to receiving the best possible medical care. The legal proceedings that followed would span years and involve multiple jurisdictions. Victoria Sterling was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, identity theft, and dozens of other felonies. Senator Morrison and his political allies faced federal corruption charges that would effectively end their careers and likely result in lengthy prison sentences. David Santiago found himself in the unique position of being both a victim and a beneficiary of the conspiracy. While he had unknowingly lived a stolen life, he had also used that life to create genuine innovations and build a company that employed thousands of people. The legal system would have to grapple with questions that had no precedent. How do you assign responsibility to someone who was a child when the crimes were committed? How do you unravel 30 years of business decisions made by someone operating under false pretenses? The resolution, when it finally came, reflected the complex moral dimensions of the case. David Santiago was granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for his full cooperation with investigators. He voluntarily transferred majority control of Whitmore Dynamics to True Marcus, while retaining a significant minority stake that would allow him to continue contributing to the company he had helped build. True Marcus chose to operate the company under his real name for the first time in his life, implementing new policies that emphasized transparency and ethical business practices. His son's medical treatment was successful, with experimental gene therapy eliminating the genetic markers that would have caused the same condition that had nearly killed his father. The two men who had shared an identity developed an unlikely friendship, bonded by their shared experiences and their mutual commitment to using their resources to help other victims of identity theft and fraud. They established a foundation dedicated to investigating cold cases involving missing children and supporting families who had been torn apart by similar crimes. Consuela Valdez lived to see justice done for her daughter's murder, finally achieving the peace that had eluded her for over 3 decades. She remained as the head housekeeper at the Malibu mansion, which became a center for the foundation's work, ensuring that her granddaughter's memory would be honored through efforts to protect other families from similar tragedies. The scandal reshaped Silicon Valley's approach to corporate governance and background verification, leading to new regulations and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar frauds. The technology industry, long accustomed to celebrating young entrepreneurs with minimal scrutiny of their backgrounds, was forced to confront the possibility that other prominent figures might be operating under false identities or fraudulent credentials. Years later, when historians and journalists analyzed the case, they would focus on the human elements that had made such a massive deception possible. The willingness of adults to sacrifice children for financial gain, the corruption of institutions that were supposed to protect the innocent, and the power of money to buy silence and complicity from people who should have known better. But they would also note the redemptive elements of the story. The courage of an elderly woman who refused to let injustice stand, the generosity of a man who chose reconciliation over revenge, and the possibility that even the most profound deceptions could be overcome through truth, compassion, and the determination to build something better from the ruins of the past. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, and the importance of maintaining ethical standards even in the pursuit of innovation and success. It reminded the world that behind every fortune and every empire were real people, whose lives could be destroyed by the ambitions and moral failures of others. Most importantly, it demonstrated that the truth, no matter how deeply buried or carefully hidden, would eventually find its way to the surface, carried by the love of those who refused to forget, and the courage of those who demanded justice. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.